My name is Louise Rogers, and at 19 years old, I am a private in the United States Army. This uniform is my pride, my ticket out of the hell on earth I used to call home. But that sweltering July night in Charleston, when I came home on leave, hell decided to claim me back. My stepfather, Thomas, reeking of cheap bourbon, pressed the cold steel of a revolver against my chest. "You think that cheap soldier suit makes you better than me?" he growled, his voice a low rumble of resentment. "Your paycheck is my paycheck." My mother stood huddled in the corner of the kitchen, trembling, her voice a barely audible whisper. "Louise, just give it to him, honey. Don't make him mad." When I stood tall, my back straight from months of training, and said, "That money is mine. It's for my service, for my future." The word future seemed to snap something inside him. His face twisted into a mask of pure fury. "You ungrateful little brat," he hissed, his grip tightening on the gun. "You think you can defy me in my own house?" A deafening explosion ripped through the air. The pain was a searing, white-hot poker, tearing through the flesh near my collarbone. Through the haze of gun smoke, I saw Thomas smirking. But he didn't know. Pain is just weakness leaving the body. And I had managed to do one thing before I ran. One thing that would utterly destroy his world. Let me know what time you're listening to this story, hit that like button, and subscribe if you believe no soldier should ever be left behind, especially not on their own home front. The crack of the gunshot was absolute. For a single, suspended moment, everything stopped. The drone of the cicadas outside, the hum of the refrigerator, the frantic beating of my own heart, all silenced by the sheer violence of the sound. Then, the world came rushing back in a tidal wave of agony. It wasn't a dull ache. It was a blinding, electric fire that shot from my shoulder, down my arm, and up into my neck. My legs gave out from under me, and I staggered backward, my head connecting with the unforgiving linoleum floor with a dull thud that rattled my teeth. The kitchen smelled of cordite and spilled bourbon. Lying on the floor, the sticky sweet puddle from the bottle Thomas had knocked over earlier was cold against my cheek. My vision swam, but through the thin, acrid cloud of smoke hanging in the air, I saw him. Thomas. He wasn't panicked. He wasn't remorseful. He was just satisfied. The smirk I'd seen a moment before was still plastered on his face. It wasn't the grin of a victor, but the cruel, detached amusement of someone watching an insect struggle in a spider's web. He was savoring my pain, luxuriating in the absolute power he held in that moment. It was then that my mother, Linda, finally screamed. But the sound that tore from her throat wasn't for me. It was a shriek of horrified disbelief aimed squarely at him. "My God, Thomas!" she cried, her hands flying to her mouth. "You shot a hole in the wall." The wall. Not her daughter, bleeding on the kitchen floor. The freshly painted drywall behind me. In that instant, the physical pain in my shoulder was eclipsed by something far worse. An icy, profound numbness that settled deep in my soul. The betrayal was so complete, so absolute, it felt like a second wound, deeper and more lethal than the first. My mother's first thought was for her property. My existence, my life, was secondary to a piece of plasterboard. And as if to hammer the point home, Thomas let out a disgusted sigh. He lowered the gun, not with the shock of a man who'd just made a terrible mistake, but with the annoyance of someone whose evening had been inconvenienced. He glanced down at me, his eyes cold and dismissive, and muttered, just loud enough for me to hear over the ringing in my ears, "See? You always gotta make things difficult." That was it. That was the moment everything changed. The shock receded, and the hot, searing pain in my body was replaced by an icy rage that clarified my mind with chilling precision. A single thought cut through the chaos. I'm not going to die here. The bullet had torn through flesh, but it hadn't hit anything vital. I wasn't dying on this sticky, bourbon-soaked floor. And if I wasn't going to die, I had to fight. My perspective shifted. Lying on my side, my eyes were level with the overturned kitchen table. Shards of glass from the shattered bourbon bottle glinted under the dim light, and there, next to the wreckage, was his phone. Its screen was still lit up. The phone. The one he carried everywhere, a black rectangular tumor attached to his hip. The one he guarded with a complex password and a paranoid fury if anyone even glanced at it. Suddenly, years of buried observations flooded my mind. The hushed, late-night phone calls, the way he would abruptly end a conversation if I walked into the room, the sudden influxes of cash after a series of angry, whispered arguments into that very device. It wasn't just a phone, it was his weakness. It was his entire shadow life, condensed into a single, vulnerable object. Thomas was still basking in his moment of dominance, turning his irritation from me to my mother, berating her for her useless screaming. "Shut up, Linda, it's just a scratch," he barked. That was his mistake. He gave me an opening, a 1-second window. Everything I had learned at Fort Jackson, every grueling drill, every shouted lesson from my drill sergeants about seizing the initiative. It all coalesced into a single, instinctive command in my brain. Act now. Ignoring the fire in my shoulder, I coiled my body, pushing through the pain with a surge of pure, unadulterated will. I lunged. My fingers scraped across the gritty linoleum, sliding through the sticky bourbon and past sharp slivers of glass. I didn't feel them cut my skin. My entire being was focused on one target. My hand closed around the phone. The cool, smooth metal was a shocking, solid reality in my palm. I clenched my fist around it, my knuckles white. This wasn't just a phone anymore. It was the black box from his crashed life. It was evidence. It was my only weapon. Shoving it deep into the cargo pocket of my uniform pants, I used my good arm to push myself up. Adrenaline, cold and powerful, surged through me, silencing the pain, sharpening my senses. I didn't look back. I didn't hesitate. I scrambled to my feet and launched myself toward the back door. I could hear Thomas's roar of fury behind me, the sound of a man who just realized he'd been outmaneuvered. "The phone! Get back here, you little—" His voice was cut off by the sound of something heavy crashing to the floor, maybe the table he'd flipped, maybe a chair he'd thrown. His curses and threats chased me out into the thick, humid Charleston night. The screen door slammed shut behind me, a final, percussive punctuation mark. I was running now, not just to save my life, but to protect the one thing that could give me justice. I was no longer a victim, cowering on a kitchen floor. I was a soldier. And this was my first, most important mission. The humid Charleston air was thick and heavy in my lungs, each breath a struggle as I ran. The adrenaline that had propelled me out of that house was starting to fade, replaced by a throbbing, insistent pain in my shoulder. Every footfall on the pavement sent a jarring shockwave through my body. But more powerful than the pain was the cold, hard weight of the phone in my pocket. It felt less like a device and more like a captured ghost, a vessel holding all the unspoken poison that had filled our home for the last 11 years. Thomas had walked into our lives when I was 8 years old. He arrived with two things: a practiced, too-wide smile that never reached his eyes, and an old flip phone that seemed permanently attached to his ear. In the beginning, the smile was for my mother, a cheap imitation of charm. For me, it was mostly indifference. But over time, the smile vanished completely, and only the phone remained. It was his private world, a portal to a place of secrets, simmering rage, and murky deals I never understood. I learned the rules of that world quickly. When Thomas was on the phone, you did not exist. You became invisible, silent. You learned to walk on eggshells, to hold your breath, to pray you didn't do anything to draw his attention from the tiny screen and the disembodied voice on the other end. I learned this the hard way when I was 9. I was carrying a glass of milk to the dinner table, my favorite bright yellow t-shirt with a cartoon sunflower on it making me feel cheerful. He was in the middle of a tense, hushed call, his back to me. My foot caught on the edge of the worn-out rug, and the glass tumbled from my hands, shattering on the floor in a splash of white. He didn't yell. He didn't hit me. What he did was far worse. He ended his call, turned around with an unnerving calm, and looked at the mess. Then he looked at me. "Get your shirt," he said, his voice flat. He made me take it off, and then he forced me to get on my hands and knees and sop up the sticky, curdling milk with that yellow t-shirt. He watched, silent and impassive, as I scrubbed until the fabric was shredded and the sunflower was an unrecognizable gray smear. He made me destroy something I loved as punishment for a simple mistake, just to prove he could. He didn't just want to control my actions, he wanted to own my joy, to extinguish any spark he saw in me. I used to have a voice. My elementary school music teacher, Mrs. Gable, said I had perfect pitch. She encouraged me to try out for the Charleston Youth Choir, a prestigious group that performed at the holidays. For weeks, I practiced. I sang in my room, in the shower, walking home from school. It was the first thing that had ever felt truly mine. The day of the audition, a sunny Saturday morning, I woke up buzzing with nervous excitement. But when I went to leave my room, the door wouldn't open. It was locked from the outside. Thomas claimed he'd misplaced the key. "Just a silly mistake," he said through the door, his voice dripping with false sympathy. I heard the front door close, heard his truck rumble to life and drive away with my mother beside him. I pounded on the door, screaming until my voice was raw, until my throat burned and my knuckles were bruised. They came back hours later from an emergency shopping trip. He casually unlocked the door, dangling the key from his finger. "Oh, here it is," he said, his eyes empty of all emotion. "Guess you missed your little singing thing, huh?" I never sang again after that. Not where he could hear me. And my mother? My mother was a master of silence. Her silence was a thick, suffocating blanket that she wrapped around our house. She was silent when Thomas would throw my plate against the wall if he decided my dinner was too salty. She was silent when he found my diary, read my most private thoughts aloud to his drinking buddies, and laughed at my childish crushes. Her silence wasn't a shield to protect me, it was a wall to protect him. I was 13 when I finally got the courage to confront her. We were alone in the kitchen, the air still and quiet. "Mom," I whispered, my voice trembling, "why do you let him do this to me?" She wouldn't look at me. She just kept staring out the window at the dying azaleas in our backyard. "He has his own demons, Louise," she said, her voice thin as a thread. You don't poke a sleeping bear." In that moment, I understood. My mother wasn't just afraid of the bear. She had become its zookeeper, and I was the one living inside the cage. The final straw wasn't a single event, but a slow, grinding erosion of my soul that culminated when I was 16. Thomas found the Army recruitment poster I kept hidden under my mattress. To him, it wasn't a dream of a better life, it was an act of treason. He saw it as me planning an escape, an abandonment of the family unit he ruled with an iron fist. He flew into a rage that was terrifying even for him. He ripped the poster of the smiling soldier from my hands, tearing it into tiny pieces, spitting that I was trying to betray the family. In his fury, he shoved me hard. My body hit the drywall, and the impact of my head left a spiderweb crack in the plaster right at eye level. That night, lying in bed, the throbbing in my head subsided, but I couldn't stop staring at that crack. It was a jagged, dark line against the pale yellow paint, like a frozen bolt of lightning. The house was silent again. The bear was sleeping. But I wasn't scared anymore. Looking at that crack, I didn't see damage. I saw a prophecy. That thin, fractured line wasn't just in the wall. It was in our family. It was in my mother's spirit. It was in me. This house, this life, it was all fundamentally broken. If you've ever had a dream, big or small, that someone tried to take from you, please hit that like button. And in the comments, just type the word dreamer to let everyone else know they're not alone. I knew then, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I had to get out. Not just run, but escape. The crack on the wall wasn't an ending. It was a map. It was pointing me toward the only way out I had left. That map, the crack in my bedroom wall, led me straight into the furnace. Fort Jackson, South Carolina, in the dead of summer, was less a military base and more a giant, sand-filled oven designed to melt you down to your weakest components and see what was left. The person who arrived was a ghost, a girl who had spent her life perfecting the art of being invisible. The first few weeks were a blur of pre-dawn wake-ups, endless push-ups in the suffocating humidity, and ruck marches under a sun that felt like a physical weight on my shoulders. I did what I was told. I followed orders with the same numb, mechanical obedience I had used to survive Thomas's tyranny. I kept my head down, blended in, and prayed no one would notice the deep, gnawing fear inside me. The voice that whispered I wasn't good enough, that I was just as weak as he always said I was. I wasn't fighting, I was just existing on a different battlefield. Then came Drill Sergeant Davis. He was a short, wiry man carved from granite and fury, with eyes that didn't just look at you, they X-rayed your soul and found every single thing you were trying to hide. One afternoon, after a particularly grueling session at the obstacle course where I'd hesitated at the top of the high wall, he pulled me aside, away from the rest of the platoon. His voice wasn't a shout, which was somehow more terrifying. It was a low, gravelly rasp. "Rogers," he said, his gaze unwavering. "I've been watching you. You do everything you're told. Your boots are shined, your bunk is tight, but you're empty. You're existing, not fighting. The Army doesn't need robots, Rogers. We need thinking warriors." I stood there, heart pounding, expecting to be punished for some unknown failure. Instead, he reached into the cargo pocket of his fatigues and pulled out a worn paperback book. The cover was creased, the pages dog-eared. Extreme Ownership by Jocko Willink. He pushed it into my hands. "Read this," he commanded. Then he leaned in a little closer, his voice dropping even lower. "I read your file. I know where you come from. Your mother told you, don't poke a sleeping bear. That's the philosophy of a prisoner, Rogers. A victim. Here," he said, tapping a finger on my chest. "We teach you how to be the bear." That night, under the faint glow of my flashlight, long after lights out, I read that book. And it wasn't like reading at all. It was like a controlled detonation going off in my head. The core idea was simple but revolutionary to me. Take absolute ownership of everything in your world. Not just your actions, but your reactions, your mindset, your future. It wasn't about blaming Thomas for my past. It was about taking responsibility for my own escape. My mother's words had taught me to shrink, to placate, to survive by being small. This book and the quiet intensity of Drill Sergeant Davis was teaching me to grow, to confront, to win by being strong. Something inside me shifted. The next morning, I woke up at 0400, a full 30 minutes before the official wake-up call. I went for a run in the pre-dawn darkness, pushing myself until my lungs burned, not because I was ordered to, but because I wanted to. I started doing extra reps in the weight room, not for Davis, but for me. The discipline stopped feeling like a punishment and started feeling like a tool. Every drop of sweat, every aching muscle, was me forging a new version of myself. I was seizing control of the only things Thomas had never been able to touch: my body and my will. For the first time in my entire life, beneath the suffocating rules and rigid structure of the U.S. Army, I felt completely and utterly free. Our training began to pivot from the purely physical to the tactical. We learned land navigation, how to read topographic maps, how to analyze terrain. We were taught to identify enemy strong points, defensible positions, and, most importantly, avenues of vulnerability. And as I sat in those sterile classrooms, a strange thing started to happen. I began superimposing the maps of Fort Jackson's training grounds over the blueprint of my own past. I started analyzing Thomas. He wasn't some invincible mythical monster. He was an opponent. And every opponent has weaknesses. His strengths were obvious: brute force, psychological manipulation, and the complicit silence of my mother. But his weaknesses were just as clear if you looked at him with a cold, tactical eye. He was an alcoholic, which meant his judgment was compromised. He was in debt, which meant he was desperate and predictable. His greatest weakness of all was his own towering arrogance, the belief that he was smarter and stronger than everyone else, especially me. And at the center of that web of weakness was his phone, that mysterious, heavily guarded piece of technology. It was his command and control center. It was his supply line. It was, I realized with a sudden, chilling clarity, the single most valuable target. To defeat a bully, you don't meet them head-on with force. You study them. You use their own weight against them. You don't attack the bear. You attack his den while he's sleeping. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place at the rifle range. The first time I held an M4 carbine, I expected it to feel alien, heavy. It wasn't. It felt balanced, a solid piece of steel and polymer that responded to my every input. All those years of holding my breath, of making myself perfectly still to avoid Thomas's attention, had given me an unintentional gift: complete control over the stillness of my own body. When I looked through the sight, the entire chaotic world of the firing range, the echoing cracks of other rifles, the shouting instructors, the smell of gunpowder, it all just disappeared. There was only me, my breathing, and the black silhouette of the target 25 yards away. Breathe in, let half out, squeeze. The rifle kicked back into my shoulder, a solid, reassuring punch. A small hole appeared in the center mass of the target. I did it again, and again. Each shot that landed true was more than just a successful mark. It was a declaration: I am in control. It was a tangible impact on the world. I am not invisible. It was the sound of my own power. I am not weak. I graduated basic training with a marksman badge pinned to my chest, a small silver medal that meant more to me than any trophy. But what I truly earned in that furnace was something far more valuable. It was the unshakable confidence that when the time came, my hands wouldn't tremble, and that when I took my shot, I wouldn't miss. I had been broken down. I had been rebuilt. I had been trained. I had learned how to be the bear. But as I packed my duffel bag for my first leave back home, a cold question slithered into my mind. Was I strong enough to face the other bear in his own den? I ran until my lungs were screaming, 2 ragged bags of fire inside my chest. The manic energy of the escape had burned away, leaving behind a deep, bone-weary exhaustion and a pain in my shoulder that had sharpened from a hot poker to 1,000 tiny shards of glass with every step. I couldn't go to the nearest hospital. That would be the first place Thomas would look. Instead, my feet, acting on some deep, forgotten instinct, carried me toward the water, toward the wide, open expanse of the Ashley River waterfront park. I remembered coming here as a little girl with my grandmother, years before Thomas, to watch the sailboats and feel the sea breeze. It was supposed to be a place of peace. Tonight, it was just a sanctuary of shadows. I collapsed onto a cold, wrought iron bench under the sprawling arms of an ancient live oak, its branches draped in ghostly Spanish moss. The world spun. My uniform t-shirt was soaked through, the dark sticky patch on my shoulder growing colder as the night air hit it. A wave of dizziness washed over me, followed by a profound, crushing loneliness. Here I was, in the heart of my own city, surrounded by the familiar scents of salt marsh and pluff mud. Yet I had never felt more invisible, more utterly alone. The training, the strength, the bear I was supposed to be, it all felt like a lie. I was just a scared 19-year-old girl, bleeding on a park bench in the dark. That's when I saw him. He was further down the path, an older man with a full head of thick white hair, standing by the railing and looking out at the dark, churning water. He was wearing a neatly pressed button-down shirt and khaki pants, an outfit too tidy for a late-night wander. My training kicked in automatically. Assess the situation, identify potential threats. I scanned him from head to toe. His posture was straight, military straight, but there was a weariness in the way he stood. A stillness that spoke not of peace, but of a heavy burden. He didn't look like a threat. He looked sad. There was a quiet solitude about him that mirrored my own. And for a moment, I felt a strange, fleeting kinship with this complete stranger. He seemed lost in his own world, completely unaware of my presence. I tried to shift my weight on the bench, to find a position that didn't send lightning bolts of pain through my shoulder, and a small involuntary gasp of pain escaped my lips. It was barely a whisper, but in the stillness of the park, it was as loud as a gunshot. The man's head turned. His gaze swept across the park, and then it landed on me. For a long second, he just looked, his eyes taking in my disheveled state, my torn shirt, and finally, the dark stain of blood. I braced myself for the usual reactions. Fear, disgust, maybe he'd just turn and walk away quickly. But his face did none of those things. Instead, his expression softened into one of pure, undiluted concern. He started walking toward me, his steps measured and calm. My body tensed. Every instinct, honed by years of living with Thomas and sharpened at Fort Jackson, screamed danger. I pushed myself back against the bench, my good hand instinctively reaching for the pocket holding Thomas's phone. He saw my reaction immediately. He stopped about 10 feet away, holding up both his hands, palms open, in the universal gesture of peace. It was a practiced, disarming movement. Then, he did something I didn't expect. He pointed to his own ear and shook his head slowly. He was deaf. The flicker of hope that had ignited in me when I saw the kindness in his eyes was instantly extinguished. Of all the people in this city, the one person who stops is someone I can't even speak to. The sheer, bitter irony of it was almost enough to make me laugh, or maybe cry. I was trapped in a world of silence, and now, so was my only potential rescuer. But then, a memory surfaced from the deep recesses of my childhood. My cousin, Sarah, who was born deaf. My aunt had taught me a few basic signs when we were kids so we could play together. It was clumsy, childish signing, long forgotten. But maybe it was enough. My hands were trembling, partly from shock, partly from the cold seeping into my bones. I slowly, awkwardly, lifted my good hand. I tapped my chest, then made a gesture like a bird's wings fluttering, the sign for hurt. Then I pointed to myself again and brought my fingertips together, pointing them forward, the sign for need. And finally, I held my hand out, palm up, help. Hurt, need, help. The man's eyes, which had been full of patient concern, now widened with surprise. A flicker of recognition passed over his face, and then his expression shifted into one of resolute determination. He signed back, his hands moving with a fluid, confident grace that made my own attempts look like a child's scribbles. He pointed to his eye, then his chest, then formed the A hand shape and moved it in a circle over his heart. I understand. He held his hands out, palms down, and moved them in a calming gesture. Stay still. Don't be afraid. I will help. As I watched his hands, a sob I didn't even know was there got caught in my throat. In my attempt to make a sign, my body shifted, and Thomas's phone slipped from my lap, clattering onto the pavement. We both looked down at it. Before I could move, he stepped forward, bent down, and picked it up. For a terrifying second, I thought he would look at the screen, ask questions, but he didn't. He held it for a moment, then, with a look of profound respect, he simply placed it gently back into my trembling hand, closing my fingers around it. It was a gesture that said, "This is yours. It's important. It's safe." He pulled out his own phone, quickly typed a message, and showed the screen to me. The bright, clean letters glowed in the darkness. Taxi to Roper Hospital. Okay? I just nodded, unable to do anything else. When the taxi's headlights cut through the darkness of the park a few minutes later, he helped me to my feet. He carefully took my uninjured arm, supporting my weight as we walked toward the curb. His hand was rough and calloused, the hand of a man who had seen a lifetime of work or service. But it was also impossibly warm. And as that warmth seeped through my thin sleeve, it was the first moment of genuine, unconditional safety I had felt in that entire horrific night. It was the hand of a stranger, but it felt more like a lifeline. The emergency room at Roper Hospital was a world away from the humid darkness of the park. It was a pocket of sterile, ordered reality, bright lights, the clean scent of antiseptic, the quiet, rhythmic beep of a heart monitor somewhere down the hall. For the first time in hours, I could finally breathe. A nurse with kind eyes and efficient hands had cleaned and stitched my wound. The bullet had passed clean through the soft tissue, she'd said, a lucky shot. It didn't feel lucky, but as I lay on the gurney, a warm blanket tucked around me, a profound sense of relief washed over me. It was the feeling of a soldier who has finally reached a fortified position after being pinned down by enemy fire. For a moment, just for a moment, I was safe. The man who brought me here, the stranger from the park, had waited patiently in the hallway. When the hospital staff asked for information, he simply presented his ID and an insurance card, handling everything with a quiet authority that commanded respect. He had introduced himself via a small leather-bound notebook he carried, writing in a neat, decisive script, "My name is Robert." He now sat in a chair beside my bed, the same notebook resting on his knee, a silent, steady presence in the chaos of my life. The physical pain in my shoulder had dulled to a persistent throb, but it was the silence, the sheer absence of threat that felt the most healing. Then I remembered. The weight in the cargo pocket of my uniform pants. The reason I was running. I reached down and pulled out Thomas's phone. It felt cold and heavy in my hand, a digital tomb holding a decade of secrets. I held it up for Robert to see. He simply nodded, his expression unreadable, but patient. He was a guardian, not an interrogator. The lock screen stared back at me, demanding a password. My heart began to hammer against my ribs. I thought back, sifting through years of unwilling observation, searching for a moment of carelessness on his part. And then, a memory surfaced. Thomas, drunk on cheap whiskey, fumbling with his phone one night, bragging to a friend about something he never forgot. His firstborn son, a boy from a marriage long before my mother, who had died of leukemia at the age of 6. My fingers trembled as I typed in the 6 digits. A birthday, 0081499 rate. The phone didn't buzz. It didn't make a sound. It simply unlocked with a soft, satisfying click. And just like that, I had opened the devil's black box. What I found inside was worse than anything I could have imagined. At first, it was what I expected. A long list of text messages with bookies, their language a mix of friendly threats and desperate promises. Messages to loan sharks with ever-increasing interest rates. It was a map of his financial ruin. But as I scrolled deeper, the sickness began to seep through. I found a text exchange with one of his drinking buddies from a few weeks ago. The friend had asked, "Did you sort out that stubborn stepdaughter yet?" My blood ran cold. I watched the 3 little dots appear as Thomas's reply loaded. "Almost. It's gonna have to pay for its own existence soon enough." It. He had called me it. Not a person, not even a problem, but an object. An expense to be dealt with. A wave of nausea washed over me. I forced myself to keep looking. There was a hidden folder in his photo gallery, tucked away and password protected with the same code. I opened it. My breath hitched in my throat. Dozens of pictures. Photographs of my grandparents' will, zoomed in on the sections detailing what they had left for me. Pictures of financial statements I'd accidentally left on the kitchen counter. And then, pictures of me, sleeping, unaware, vulnerable. He had been documenting my life not as a father, but as a spy collecting intelligence on an enemy target. The worst, however, was the videos. This wasn't just a collection of files, it was a predator's trophy case. He had secretly recorded his arguments with my mother, positioning the phone to capture her crying, her pleading. He had recorded himself in a drunken rage, smashing plates against the wall, his voice a guttural roar. He had recorded the aftermath, panning the camera slowly across the wreckage with a kind of sick pride. He hadn't recorded this evidence against himself to hide it. He recorded it to relive it, to savor it. This wasn't the work of a man with a bad temper. This was the calculated cruelty of a monster who enjoyed his own monstrosity. Just as I was about to show Robert, his own phone vibrated on the small table next to me. He picked it up, his brow furrowed as he read the screen. He looked at me, then back at the phone, his expression suddenly hardening. He tilted the screen so I could see it. It was a message from a friend containing a link to a local Charleston news blog, and above the link, a headline that made the air leave my lungs. Local Army private on leave attacks stepfather in dispute over money. My world tilted on its axis. He had done it. The monster had already started the war. Thomas had called the police and fed them a perfectly crafted story. A story where I was the aggressor. A story where my military training, my greatest source of pride, was twisted into a weapon. The article mentioned I was being investigated for assault, quoting an anonymous source who suggested I was suffering from combat-related PTSD. It was a lie so venomous, so brilliant in its cruelty, that it almost paralyzed me. He was trying to destroy my career, my honor, my very identity, before I could even fight back. The article ended by stating that my mother, Linda Rogers, had given a distraught and unclear statement, neither confirming nor denying the events. He had neutralized her with fear. The battle was no longer in that kitchen. It was everywhere. And Thomas was already winning. I looked at Robert, my eyes wide with panic. He saw the terror on my face. He saw the monster's checkmate before it had even happened. His calm demeanor vanished, replaced by a cold, focused fury that was more intense than any of Thomas's drunken rages. He took his notebook, flipped to a clean page, and wrote 3 words in his clean, decisive script. He underlined them twice. Then, he pushed the notebook toward me. Now, we fight. The 3 words on the page seemed to burn with a white-hot intensity, a declaration so powerful it silenced the frantic drumbeat of panic in my head. Now, we fight. I looked up from the notebook into Robert's eyes. The quiet, gentle concern I had seen in the park was gone. In its place was something ancient and formidable, a cold, hard fire forged in crucibles I could only imagine. It was the look of a commander assessing a battlefield, calculating the odds, and preparing to unleash overwhelming force. The fear that had been coiling in my stomach for the past hour didn't vanish, but for the first time, it was joined by something else. A flicker of hope. A sense that I was no longer a lone soldier caught behind enemy lines. Robert looked at me, a long, steady gaze that seemed to see right through the terrified 19-year-old to the soldier underneath. He took his notebook back and wrote again, his script still perfectly neat despite the urgency of the situation. The evidence on that phone is our ammunition, but his lies are the terrain. He's trying to poison the well, to discredit you with your own uniform before you can even speak. He paused, his pen hovering over the page. They will use the army against you if we let them. My eyes welled up with tears. I thought of my drill sergeants, of the uniform I had worked so hard to earn, the pride I felt wearing it. The thought of it being used as a weapon to destroy me was a betrayal almost as deep as Thomas's. I shakily picked up the pen he offered me. My handwriting was a jagged mess compared to his. I don't know what to do, I wrote. He read my words, and his expression softened for just a moment. He reached out and placed a firm, steadying hand on my good shoulder, a simple gesture of reassurance that anchored me in the spinning chaos. Then he took the notebook one last time and wrote a final sentence before the world changed. You don't have to know. You just have to stand your ground. My turn. With that, he reached into the back pocket of his khaki pants and pulled out a worn leather wallet. I thought he was going to get some cash, maybe for a vending machine coffee. He didn't. He bypassed the bills and cards, flipping to a clear plastic window. He carefully slid out a single laminated card and placed it on the crisp white hospital blanket in front of me. It was a military ID. My breath caught in my throat. I leaned forward, my eyes struggling to focus on the text under the seal of the Department of the Army. And then I saw it. The name, printed in stark, official capital letters, Callahan, Robert J. And beneath it, the rank that made my heart stop. Lieutenant General. Below the rank, 3 silver stars were emblazoned on the card, shining like distant, powerful constellations under the fluorescent hospital lights. Lieutenant General, a 3-star general. The quiet, kind, deaf man who had found me bleeding on a park bench wasn't just a veteran. He was one of the highest-ranking active duty officers in the entire United States Army. I looked from the card back to his face, my mind struggling to reconcile the two realities. He saw the shock and disbelief in my eyes. He gave me a small, sad smile and signed with a swift, almost imperceptible movement. I was on leave. He paused, then his hands moved again, this time with a sharp, cutting finality. But my leave is now over. For the next hour, my small, sterile hospital room was transformed into a field command center. General Callahan didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His power was in the quiet, deadly efficiency of his actions. He used his phone to send a firestorm of text messages, his thumbs moving with practice speed. A message to his aide, a message to the commanding officer at Fort Jackson, alerting them that a soldier from their training post was under duress. Then he made a call, using a text-to-speech app. I could hear the synthesized voice, calm and even, but the words it spoke carried the weight of an artillery strike. "This is General Callahan. Get me the Judge Advocate General." There was a brief pause. Then he spoke again, and the words were etched into my memory. "I have a private under my protection who has been assaulted on American soil. Her character is being assassinated as we speak. I want a JAG team, your best. I want them in Charleston before sunrise. Is that clear?" He listened, then ended the call. No shouting, no threats, just a clear, concise order that sent shockwaves through the chain of command. The massive, bureaucratic machine of the U.S. Army, a machine I knew to be slow and cumbersome, began to grind into motion with terrifying speed and precision. All for one private first class. All for me. The next morning, I woke to the first real, restful sleep I'd had in years. And the first thing I saw was the reason why. Standing silently outside my hospital room door were two figures. They were military police, dressed in their formal Army service uniforms, their presence a silent, unwavering declaration. They weren't there to investigate me. They were there to guard me. They were a human shield, a physical representation of the general's promise. And then, I saw him. Thomas appeared at the far end of the hallway. He was holding a cheap bouquet of gas station carnations, a greasy, practiced look of concern on his face. He was here to play the part of the worried stepfather for the nurses and staff. He started walking toward my room, but he froze when he saw the two MPs. His smug confidence evaporated, replaced by a flicker of confusion, then alarm. He tried to push past them, his voice oozing false concern. "I'm here to see my daughter, Louise." One of the MPs, a sergeant with a jawline that looked like it was carved from granite, didn't even flinch. He simply raised a hand, a gesture that was both polite and an absolute, unbreakable barrier. "Sir, this is a restricted area." Thomas sputtered. "Restricted? What are you talking about? I'm her family." The MP's expression remained perfectly neutral, his voice flat and devoid of any emotion. "Private Rogers is not accepting visitors at this time. You need to leave, sir." If you've ever been made to feel small and wished for a guardian angel to step in, hit that like button. And tell me in the comments, what's one word you would use to describe General Callahan? For the first time in my entire life, I saw Thomas Walker look exactly what he was: small, powerless, and afraid. The bear had been poked, and now the eagle had answered. The 2 days that followed were like living in the calm, focused eye of a hurricane. The world outside was a swirling chaos of Thomas's lies, but inside my guarded hospital room and the adjacent waiting area, a different kind of storm was gathering, one of strategy, precision, and cold, hard facts. General Callahan's promised JAG team had arrived before sunrise, and they weren't just lawyers. They were soldiers armed with briefcases and legal statutes. Leading them was Major Isabella Rossi. She was a compact, sharp-featured woman with dark, intelligent eyes that missed nothing. The team had a nickname for her, the Hammer. And within an hour of meeting her, I understood why. She didn't offer condolences or sympathy. She offered a battle plan. The waiting room, with its faded floral chairs and outdated magazines, was instantly converted into a war room. Laptops hummed, documents were printed, and Thomas's entire pathetic life, as documented on his own phone, was methodically dismantled and laid bare on a conference table they'd had brought in. It was mesmerizing to watch. They moved with a quiet, relentless efficiency that was both terrifying and deeply comforting. They weren't just looking at the videos and texts, they were cross-referencing them. They pulled Thomas's financial records, matching his desperate texts to bookies with actual cash withdrawals. They uncovered old public disturbance reports the Charleston PD had dismissed years ago, filed by neighbors tired of his drunken yelling. They were building a fortress of evidence around me, brick by irrefutable brick. My testimony was important, Major Rossi explained, but it wouldn't be the foundation of our case. The foundation would be Thomas's own words, his own actions, his own recorded monstrosity. While we built our case in the quiet, sterile environment of the hospital, Thomas was fighting his war in the mud. Blocked from seeing me, he had pivoted to the court of public opinion. We found the interview he'd given to some local Charleston blogger with a small but loyal following. I watched the video on one of the team's laptops, my stomach churning. There he was, face puffy and red, trying to squeeze out crocodile tears. He spoke of his troubled stepdaughter, painting a picture of a sweet girl who had been changed by the military, made aggressive and paranoid. He held up old family photos from years ago, forced smiles at a forgotten Christmas, a tense barbecue, presenting them as proof of the devoted stepfather he was. His story was a masterclass in manipulation. It preyed on civilian stereotypes of veterans, twisting my service into a symptom of instability. And it worked. The comments section under the blog post was a sewer of vitriol. Another broken soldier. She probably has PTSD and snapped. Thank God he's okay, that poor man. I felt a hot surge of rage and helplessness. He was assassinating my character with the very honor I'd fought so hard to build. He was trying to ensure that by the time I walked into a courtroom, the jury would already see me as the villain. But Thomas knew the public was only one front. The real battle depended on the weakest link in my chain of defense, my mother. While Major Rossi's team built their case, he began his campaign of psychological terror against her. I could only imagine it, but I knew his playbook by heart. He would have started with the sweet, manipulative voice, the one he used when he wanted something. I could almost hear him through the phone line, his words dripping with false sincerity. "Linda, baby, we're a family. We just have to get through this. You just need to tell them how confused the girl was, how she panicked." And when that didn't work, the threats would follow. I knew the words before they were even spoken. "You know who pays the rent for this house, Linda. You know who keeps the lights on. You breathe one word against me, and you and your whole damn family will be out on the street. Don't you dare forget that." My mother retreated into the fortress she knew best: silence. She didn't answer my calls. She didn't answer the calls from Major Rossi's team. Her house, when a paralegal drove by, was dark. The curtains were drawn. She was a prisoner in her own home, caught in the crossfire between her daughter and her captor. I confessed my fear to General Callahan, signing shakily that I was worried Thomas would break her. The general listened patiently, his gaze never leaving my hands. He didn't offer false promises. Instead, he made a strategic decision that showed more wisdom than any legal argument. He didn't send another lawyer. He didn't send the police. He made a call. And the next afternoon, an unexpected visitor knocked on my mother's door. It was a woman in her 50s with a kind face and a gentle demeanor, dressed in the uniform of a U.S. Army chaplain. She was also, as the general had informed me, a licensed therapist specializing in trauma. She didn't come with a briefcase full of documents. She came with a box of chamomile tea. She didn't ask my mother a single question about the case. She just sat with her in the dim light of the living room, brewed a pot of tea, and said, "Linda, my name is Chaplain Davis. I was asked to check in on you. I'm just here to listen." That small act of compassion was a weapon Thomas had no defense against. The chaplain sat with my mother for 2 hours. They talked about the weather, about gardening, about a hymn my mother used to love as a child. And only at the very end, as she was leaving, did the chaplain gently say, "The Bible teaches us about the power of truth and the importance of courage. But sometimes, Linda, courage isn't a roar. Sometimes it's just a quiet whisper of truth, no matter how small." The visit didn't cause a miracle. My mother didn't suddenly pick up the phone and agree to testify. But it planted a seed. It was a single ray of light that pierced through the suffocating darkness of her fear. For the first time, the wall of silence began to show the faintest of cracks. That evening, Major Rossi and I had our final meeting before the preliminary hearing. All the evidence was organized into binders, every video bookmarked, every text message highlighted. We were ready. "We have his finances, his pattern of abuse, his own words confessing his motives," Rossi said, her voice calm and confident. She looked up from her files and met my gaze, her expression turning serious. "We have enough to bury him, Private. But in a courtroom, facts are only part of the story. The jury will be watching one person more than anyone else." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a near whisper, each word landing with the weight of a judge's gavel. Your mother is the key, Private. She can either open the door to justice or she can lock it forever. The day of the hearing, I didn't walk into the Charleston County Courthouse. I marched. At my side was General Callahan. We were both in our full Army service uniforms, the formal Class A's. My jacket was perfectly pressed, the brass buttons polished to a high gleam. My hair was pulled back into a tight regulation bun. Every crease, every angle of my uniform was a testament to the discipline that had saved my life. The general was a walking monument to honor, his chest a testament to a lifetime of service, the rows of ribbons a quiet but powerful story. When we entered the courtroom, a hush fell over the room. The power dynamic had been set before a single word was spoken. Across the aisle, Thomas sat next to his public defender, looking pathetic in a cheap polyester suit that was too tight in the shoulders. He was trying to project the image of a wronged, heartbroken man, but all I could see was a cornered animal, sweating under the fluorescent lights. The contrast between us was a physical thing, a chasm of honor versus desperation. He was a man in a costume. I was a soldier in my uniform. When it was my turn to take the stand, I moved with the efficiency I had been taught. I swore the oath, my voice clear and steady. Major Rossi began her questioning, and I recounted the events of that night. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I delivered my testimony like an after-action report, using the language of a soldier. At approximately 2100 hours, the subject, Thomas Walker, escalated his verbal aggression, I said, looking directly at the jury. He then brandished a deadly weapon and discharged it, resulting in a non-fatal gunshot wound to my person. Thomas's lawyer tried to dismantle me on cross-examination. He hammered on the PTSD angle, his questions dripping with condescending pity. Private Rogers, he began, isn't it true that the stresses of military training can cause emotional instability? I held his gaze. I didn't look at the jury or the judge. I looked right at him. Sir, I said, my voice cutting through the quiet courtroom. I was trained to face the enemy. I was trained to handle pressure and to run towards the sound of gunfire. I was not trained to be shot by my own family in my own kitchen. There is no training manual for that. A murmur went through the courtroom. The lawyer, flustered, had no more questions. Then Major Rossi turned to the judge. Your Honor, the prosecution would now like to present the contents of the defendant's phone. This was the moment the battle turned into a slaughter. Rossi systematically presented the evidence from the devil's black box. The projector screen lit up with Thomas's desperate texts to his bookies. Then, the sickening photos he'd taken of my grandparents' will. And then, the videos. The courtroom was plunged into a dead, horrified silence as the first video played. It was Thomas, his face bloated and red with rage, screaming at my mother, his voice a guttural roar as he hurled a kitchen chair against the wall. The sound of splintering wood and my mother's terrified sobs filled the room. Thomas sat at the defendant's table, his face ashen, a sheen of sweat on his forehead. His lawyer leaped to his feet. Objection, Your Honor, this is irrelevant and prejudicial. The judge, a stern-faced woman who had been watching the proceedings with an unreadable expression, didn't even look at him. She looked at the jury, then at the screen. I believe the jury needs to understand the context for the fear that a key witness has been operating under. Objection overruled. Proceed, Major Rossi. Video after video played, each one a nail in Thomas's coffin, each one a testament to the private hell he had created. And finally, the moment of truth arrived. The prosecution calls Linda Walker to the stand. My mother looked like a ghost. She was so frail, so fragile, as she made her way to the witness stand. She wouldn't look at me. She wouldn't look at Thomas. Her eyes were fixed on the floor, as if the worn pattern of the courthouse linoleum held the answers to the universe. Thomas's lawyer approached her first, his voice gentle and coaxing. Mrs. Walker, he said softly, was your daughter agitated that night? Yes, my mother whispered, her voice barely audible. And did she get into a physical struggle with your husband? He pressed. My mother hesitated. Her hands were trembling, twisting a crumpled tissue into knots. She looked like she was about to break. That's when Major Rossi stood up. She didn't approach the stand. She stood by the prosecution's table, her voice soft but carrying an undeniable weight of authority. "Mrs. Walker," she said not unkindly. "Linda, please, look at your daughter." Slowly, hesitantly, my mother lifted her head. Her eyes met mine across the courtroom. I didn't plead with her. I didn't show anger or pain. I just held her gaze, my uniform a silent testament to the person I had become in spite of everything. "Linda," Major Rossi continued, her voice gentle but firm. "Look at that uniform she is wearing. Look at the soldier she has become. Now please, tell the jury the truth. Do you honestly believe that your daughter, Private Louise Rogers, assaulted that man?" It was as if a spell had been broken. My mother looked at me, really looked at me, and in that instant, she wasn't Thomas Walker's terrified wife anymore. She was my mother. A dam of fear and silence that had been building for over a decade finally burst. She broke down, her body shaking with gut-wrenching sobs. "No!" she cried out, her voice raw with anguish and regret. "No, she didn't do anything. It was him. It was always him. I was so scared." That was it. That was the moment Thomas's mask of sanity and victimhood was utterly incinerated. He couldn't control himself. The monster was unleashed. He shot up from his chair, slamming both hands down on the table with a deafening crack. "You treacherous bitch!" he roared, his face a purple mask of pure, undiluted rage. His own words, his own uncontrollable fury, had signed his death warrant. He had exposed the monster for everyone to see. There were gasps from the jury box. The judge's eyes narrowed into slits of cold fury. 2 bailiffs were already moving toward him. The stage of truth had claimed its final victim. And it wasn't me. The judge's gavel came down with a sharp crack, a sound of absolute finality that echoed in the suddenly silent courtroom. Thomas Walker was found guilty on all counts: aggravated assault, illegal discharge of a weapon. The sentence was handed down swiftly: 25 years. As the bailiffs moved in, cuffed his hands behind his back, and led him away, I didn't feel the surge of triumphant joy I'd expected. There was no elation, no desire to cheer. There was only a profound, bone-deep sense of relief, as if a 2-ton weight I had been carrying on my shoulders my entire life had just been lifted. And then, in its place, a vast, echoing emptiness settled in. The monster was gone, but the cage he'd built around my life was still there. And its door was now swinging open into a future I had no map for. Justice had been served, but it couldn't erase the scars. After the courtroom cleared, I remained in my seat, the polished wood of the gallery bench cool beneath my hands. General Callahan sat beside me in the quiet, a solid, unwavering presence. He didn't offer words or platitudes. He simply reached over and placed a hand on my shoulder. He looked at me, his eyes full of a deep, knowing empathy, and signed, his movements slow and deliberate. "You did it. You stood your ground." I simply nodded, the first tears of the entire ordeal finally beginning to well in my eyes. They weren't tears of sadness or of joy. They were tears of pure, unadulterated exhaustion. The war was over. A few days later, a text message lit up my phone. It was from my mother. "Can we meet?" My first instinct was to say no, to protect the fragile peace I was just beginning to feel. But I knew I couldn't. We agreed to meet at the old St. Michael's Church downtown, the one with the tall white steeple, the very church where I had once dreamed of singing in the choir before Thomas had locked me in my room. It felt fitting to meet at the scene of a murdered dream to discuss the possibility of a new beginning. She was sitting on the wide marble steps when I arrived, looking smaller and older than I had ever seen her. The years of fear had etched themselves into her face, leaving behind a roadmap of quiet suffering. She didn't offer an apology when I sat down beside her, leaving a careful space between us. There were no easy words for the chasm that separated us. "I've started going to a support group," she said, her voice a thin, fragile whisper. "At the community center." She kept her eyes on her hands, which were twisting a tissue in her lap. They told me that fear isn't an excuse, but that it's real. The fear is real. I didn't say anything. I just listened. There was no single sentence, no apology that could undo a decade of silence. But her words weren't an excuse. They were a confession, an admission. And for the first time in a long, long time, it felt like a start. In the weeks I spent in Charleston waiting for my official orders to return to my unit at Fort Bragg, I found myself seeking out a different kind of structure. Chaplain Davis, the kind woman who had visited my mother, invited me to a small Bible study group she held on Wednesday nights in the church's fellowship hall. I was hesitant at first, unsure of what I was looking for. But I went. We sat around a simple wooden table, a small group of strangers, and we read. One night, the chaplain shared a verse from Ephesians. Her voice was gentle as she read, "Be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other, just as in Christ, God forgave you." The word forgiving snagged in my mind. How could I forgive? How could I forgive the man who had tried to kill me, the mother who had let him, the years that had been stolen from me? I voiced the question aloud, my voice barely a whisper. The chaplain looked at me, her eyes full of wisdom. "Louise," she said gently, "forgiveness doesn't mean you're erasing what he did. It doesn't mean you're saying it was okay. Forgiveness is about you. It's about refusing to let his sins continue to have power over your life. It's about taking the keys to your own prison back from your jailer." Her words settled deep in my soul. I realized she was right. Forgiving Thomas wasn't for him. It was for me. It was the final act of taking control. And more than that, I knew I had to learn how to forgive my mother, not for her fear, but for my own peace. My last day in Charleston, I met my mother for coffee at a small cafe, a neutral space far from the ghosts of our old house. She looked a little stronger, the haunted look in her eyes replaced by a quiet resolve. "I'm selling the house," she said, stirring her coffee without looking at it. "I can't live there anymore, not with all the ghosts." She finally looked up at me. "I'm going to get a small apartment, just for me." I nodded slowly. It was the right decision, a clean break. I took a deep breath, knowing what I had to say next was the hardest and most important thing I'd ever say to her. "Mom," I began, my voice steady and clear, just as I'd been trained to make it. "I love you. I want you to know that." I saw tears well up in her eyes. "But I need time, and I need you to keep going to your meetings. I need you to keep healing, for you." It was the first real boundary I'd ever set with her. It wasn't a wall built of anger or resentment. It was a line drawn with love, and for the first time, with self-respect. She didn't argue. She didn't try to guilt me. She just nodded, a single tear tracing a path down her cheek. "I understand," she whispered. "You deserve your peace, Louise. You've earned it." As I prepared to drive back to Fort Bragg, back to my real home, I looked out at the Charleston skyline. The war was over. The verdict had been read, the sentence handed down. But I knew, deep down, that the real healing was just beginning. How do you build a new life from the ashes of the old one? I didn't have the answer yet. But for the first time, I felt strong enough to start asking the question. Driving back through the gates of Fort Bragg, I didn't feel like I was returning to a job. I felt like I was coming home. The neat rows of barracks, the sight of soldiers jogging in formation under the North Carolina pines, the familiar rhythm of life on a military base. It was the structure and stability I'd craved my entire life. When I walked back into my unit, I wasn't met with whispers or pity. I was met with firm handshakes and quiet nods of respect. They didn't see a victim or a troublemaker. They saw a soldier who had fought a battle on the home front and won. It was in their quiet acceptance that I finally understood a profound truth. Family isn't always about the blood you share. Sometimes it's about the people who stand with you in the trenches, whether those trenches are in a foreign desert or in your own backyard. This was my brotherhood, my sisterhood. This was my family. General Callahan and I kept in touch. He became the mentor, the steady father figure I never had. We'd have video calls where he'd patiently watch me sign, offering advice and encouragement. During one of our calls, he urged me not to bury what had happened. Rogers, he signed, his hands moving with their familiar grace, your pain, when shared, can become armor for someone else. His words resonated deep within me. He saw my story not as a source of shame, but as a potential source of strength. Inspired by his words and by the glaring gaps in the system my case had exposed, the Army, with General Callahan's advocacy, initiated a new program. They called it the Sentinel Project, a task force dedicated to raising awareness and providing immediate support for service members who were victims of domestic abuse. It was a proactive measure, a way to stand guard over their own. And when they asked for volunteers to speak to new recruits, to share their experiences, I knew I had to do it. The girl who had been silenced for so long was finally being asked to speak. 6 months after the trial, I stood backstage in an auditorium at Fort Jackson, the very place where I had been broken down and rebuilt. I was no longer Private Rogers. I had been promoted. Now, the sharp chevrons of a sergeant were stitched onto my sleeve, but as I listened to the low murmur of hundreds of new recruits filling the seats, my heart hammered against my ribs. The old fear, the ghost of the girl who wasn't good enough, whispered in my ear. Who are you to teach them anything? Then I remembered the faces of my fellow soldiers. I remembered the unwavering support of General Callahan. And I remembered the look in my mother's eyes when she finally chose truth over fear. I took a deep breath, straightened my uniform, and walked onto the stage. The bright lights were blinding for a moment. I stood at the podium, looking out at a sea of young, eager, and terrified faces. They were just like I had been, kids from all over America, running from something or running toward something, all hoping the Army would give them a purpose. And as I scanned the crowd, I saw it. In the eyes of a few, a silent pain that I recognized all too well, a haunted look that had nothing to do with the rigors of basic training. It was the look of someone who knew what it was like to be at war before they ever put on a uniform. In that moment, my fear vanished. I knew why I was there. I didn't start with the violence. I didn't start with the tragedy. I started with strategy. My name is Sergeant Louise Rogers, I began, my voice clear and strong, amplified by the microphone. Today, I'm not here to talk to you about battlefield tactics. I'm here to talk to you about survival tactics. Because the most dangerous enemy you ever face might not be overseas. Sometimes the enemy is waiting for you right at home. I told them my story. Not as a victim seeking pity, but as an NCO giving a tactical briefing. I spoke about the importance of identifying an adversary's weaknesses, how Thomas's arrogance and his reliance on that phone were his critical vulnerabilities. I talked about the necessity of gathering intelligence, explaining how the phone became my single most important piece of evidence. I stressed the courage it takes to find your allies, to trust someone outside the chain of command when the chain is broken, just as I had trusted a kind stranger on a park bench. I was reframing my trauma, turning it into a lesson plan for survival. I was teaching them how to be the bear. As I reached the end of my speech, I looked out over the crowd. The entire hall was silent, every eye locked on me. In the front row, General Callahan sat watching, a small proud smile on his face. And a few seats down from him, I saw my mother. She had driven all the way from Charleston to be there. Her eyes were filled with tears, but this time, they weren't tears of fear or regret. They were tears of pride. I took a final breath and delivered my closing statement, my voice ringing with a conviction I had earned in fire. My stepfather used to tell me that the Army couldn't make me better than him, I said, my voice resonating with strength. He was wrong. The Army didn't make me better than him. It made me myself. It taught me that silence only protects the abuser. Speaking up is what protects the soldier. Your story, every scar, every fear, every moment of survival, is your most powerful weapon. Never, ever let anyone take it from you. I finished, and for a heartbeat, there was silence. Then, a single soldier in the back stood up and started to clap. Then, another. And another. Within seconds, the entire auditorium was on its feet. The sound of their applause, a thunderous roar that washed over me, a wave of validation and acceptance. It was a new dawn, one brighter than any Charleston sunrise. It was a dawn I had made for myself. That's my story. but I know the journey doesn't truly end here. Thank you for listening, for being a witness to my fight. My story is proof that even in the darkest moments, one person, one single act of kindness, can change the entire course of a battle. If this story resonated with you, I want to hear from yours. In the comments below, tell me about one person who believed in you when you needed it most. Let's fill this space with strength, and if you believe in the power of overcoming, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories of resilience.